So next up, we're going to talk about hyperkalemia and the electrocardiographic findings of hyperkalemia. Of course, everybody learns how to diagnose hyper-K on the ECG. This was a really, really interesting article. Now, previous studies have thrown some curveballs in there and made us question how good the ECG really is at picking up hyper-K, because we know that there's some cases of severe hyper-K where the ECG looks pretty good, and there's other cases that we've all seen where the ECG looks really bad and yet the patient's doing pretty well. So how does clinical status and ECG really correlate? Well, in this study, the authors looked at 188 patients with hyperkalemia of at least 6.5 milliequivalents per liter, and remembering that normal values is about 3.5 up to 5.5. And then they looked at the 6-hour rate of adverse effects. Adverse effects they defined as symptomatic arrhythmia, arrest, or death. Those would be pretty adverse.
Yeah, that sounds pretty adverse to me.
15% of the patients went on to have one of those adverse events within 6 hours, and then they went back and looked at the ECG and correlated the adverse effects with the presenting ECG findings, and there were some really interesting points that came up. Number one, first pearl peaked. Well, before we get there, the first pearl is that 100% of adverse events were preceded by ECG abnormalities. And so what that means is that if the ECG looks normal, then the chance of them having an adverse event is extremely low, approaching zero. So that's reassuring.
Yeah.
But what was really surprising to me, and I'm sure to the authors, were that peak T waves did not at all predict adverse events. People could have peak T waves that look just as peak as this mountain. I don't know what mountain that is.
That's the Peak T mountain.
That's the Peak T mountain.
Yeah, that's what it's called.
That's called Mount Hyper-K.
That's right.
So the Peak Ts are a sign that there's a problem, but not a sign of impending doom.
That's exactly
very interesting.
Put it so eloquently.
Yeah.
I wish I'd said it that way.
That's the first time you've ever said something eloquently. Really good.
So
proud of
my
you.
work here is done.
So now we're not saying to ignore peak T waves, but again, it's reassuring. If that's all you've got, the patient's probably going to do okay, and you don't have to abandon that stroke in STEMI patient.
That's a cool one.
But here's the other really interesting things. The most concerning ECG findings that predicted adverse events were bradycardia rhythms. Bradycardia had a relative risk of 12.29, and I don't know exactly what relative risk means, but it's higher than the other things. So that's got to be concerning. Ventricular escape, 7.67, junctional rhythm, 7.46, QRS prolongation. I learned peak T waves are number one, and then you always really start worrying with the QRS prolongation, and yet it turned out that the bradycardia was far in excess of QRS prolongation in terms of its ability to predict adverse outcomes.
Wow.
And so the bottom three, junctional rhythm, ventricular escape rhythm, and flat-out bradycardia, slow rhythms in hyperkalemia should really, really make you worry.